So I've talked a lot about foreign policy, but today I want to switch it up and talk about some domestic policy because it's obviously also super important. People are dying right here at home. And I just saw an interview that Joe Biden gave with Chris Cuomo from CNN, and I just knew I had to make a video about it because of this crazy quote he said. Joe Biden said, "I noticed the measures in the Affordable Care Act work pretty well. Put 20 million people back and gave them health insurance." And he went on to say how, the Affordable Care Act helped people with pre-existing conditions, yada yada yada. And I just wanted to respond to Joe Biden because he fundamentally doesn't understand universal health care and the left wing position on it. All the way back in the 1940s, President Truman was running on universal health care. The same guy who nuked Japan twice, fought in the Korean War. Universal health care was a New Deal policy all the way back in the 40s, and we're still talking about it. And in the meantime, every other developed country on earth has implemented some form or another of a universal health care system. So if you want to talk about American exceptionalism, well, here's an exception for you. America is the only developed country on earth, wait for it, not to have a universal health care system. We somehow think it's morally justifiable. Well, not that Congress really cares about morality, but the American people have not rioted in the streets over implementing a universal healthcare system, but we really should be, and I'll tell you why. A Harvard School of Medicine study found that 45,000 people die every year due to a lack of health care and a lack of access to medical care for treatable conditions. 45,000 people a year are dying. Now, if 45,000 people were dying in a more visible way, maybe people would actually care. I know, right now, you have, I think last year, 20 to 30 people died in these U.S. concentration camps on the southern border that, Trump is holding migrant children in. And that's an absolute travesty. And people are up in arms about it, rightfully so, and I support those people. But at the same time, 45,000 people are dying every year due to lack of health insurance. We should be up in arms about, people are up in arms about that, but we should honestly be holding protests every single day over an issue like this. It's just disgusting how it's not addressed nearly enough, and how you have the Democratic leadership like Nancy Pelosi spending all her resources fighting with her own party, trying to quench the left-wing sect of the House right now, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ro Khan, other Justice Democrats who are trying to push the national conversation and push this legislation forward for universal health care to save these 45,000 people who are dying every year. And that's only the people who are dying. Medical bankruptcy is the number one form of bankruptcy in America. Tons of people go bankrupt, lose their house, basically lose their lives, just trying to afford treatment for deadly diseases. People on their deathbeds, instead of spending time with their loved ones, are worrying about how they're going to afford it, how their families can afford their treatment after they're dead. People committing suicide just because they don't want to put their family through all the pain of having to lose all their inheritance, all the money they've built throughout their entire lives. 30 million people today in the US or more are uninsured, and countless more cannot afford their deductibles. People die all the time because they cannot afford their prescription drugs. You hear countless stories about people, with diseases like diabetes who cannot afford their insulin, even when they have health insurance because of these crazy high deductibles. And I'll tell you why those deductibles are so outrageously high in the US. It's because we have a system where your public tax dollars goes directly into developing prescription drugs in the first place, in universities and national labs, all over the place. Your tax dollars goes to research, which funds drug development. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing about America. We have, a lot of research, but at the same time, we end up handing over these private patents to huge pharma corporations who then turn around and exploit the American people by charging outrageous rates for life-saving medicine. And you know what? We let them do it. It's our fault. Now, they have tons of lobbying groups and they have tons of money because they've been exploiting the American people for so long. But we really need to be protesting this. I mean, the only reason they could charge such outrageous rates is because the US fucked up healthcare system to begin with that lets them line their executive pockets with millions of dollars each year. Instead of going to healthcare, instead of going to drug development, American tax dollars go to paying executives and CEOs of major pharma and healthcare companies tens of millions of dollars each year. And at the same time, you have Trump giving those same companies corporate tax rates, all of them, of course, lobbying and buying the elections to begin with. But this is why every other developed country on earth pays less in drug prices, since you have government run universal healthcare systems which negotiate the drug prices down. So in the US right now we have a couple different government run healthcare systems. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid, the veterans have their own healthcare system. I mean, if you're a veteran, you already basically have a universal healthcare system, interesting enough. And if you're elderly, you kind of have this public option. But the point of Medicare for All is it shouldn't be an option. Healthcare is not an option. You shouldn't have the option to get treatment, because option doesn't mean that you actually get effective treatment. Just because there's access to healthcare doesn't mean you can get it. Access may mean you have to go bankrupt. It may mean you lose your house. It may mean your family's future is at stake. You can no longer afford your child's college tuition. I mean, how does a parent deal with this kind of thing? So bringing it back to Joe Biden's quote there, Obamacare is not working. It was a right-wing plan to begin with, developed by the Heritage Foundation, and somehow Nancy Pelosi still managed not to get a single Republican vote in the House. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, you hear mainstream media talking about how she's some god who just manages to pass anything. You hear all the time about how she's the resistance to Trump. Well, Nancy Pelosi, her greatest accomplishment is passing Obamacare, which still has 30 million people uninsured right now. It's a failing system that can't negotiate drug prices. The American people are dying each year, and we call it an accomplishment, okay? Just because it was better than our fucked up system before doesn't mean it's a good system. We can't simply slap a Band-Aid on Obamacare and call it universal health care. You hear all these Democratic candidates like Joe Biden, but tons of other, most of them are pretty irrelevant at this point because none of them are going to, make it through the next couple months in the primary season. But you have Amy Klobuchar, Jay Inslee, all these complete, utter wankers polling at 1%, maybe 2% if they're super lucky that day, just bashing universal health care left and right from a very far right perspective as well. But what we actually need is fundamental change in this country. The system is broken. A system that allows 30 million people to go uninsured, 45,000 people to die every year, tens of thousands of medical bankruptcies every year. That's a broken system. We need fundamental change in this country. And Joe, quote unquote, nothing will fundamentally change Biden, is not going to be the one to fix that broken system. I absolutely guarantee it to you. So we must oppose Biden's candidacy as much as we can. On healthcare alone, where 45,000 people die a year, I'm just going to keep saying that. Let that sink in. 45,000 people die each year due to lack of health insurance in the US. This is a system that allows that to take place. It's absolutely immoral. If we had any moral backbone, we would have passed universal health care in the 1940s, where the US was, and probably still is today, the richest country on earth. So this is true American exceptionalism. If every other developed country on earth can have a universal health care system, then so can we, Joe Biden. It's not some pie in the sky dream, okay? We're the odd man out. We're the one dancing in the corner. We're the loser. Stop saying we're better than everyone else when the US pays twice as much per capita on healthcare than every other developed country on earth, yet we have a system that doesn't work where 45,000 people die a year due to lack of health insurance. We have worse health outcomes, yet we pay twice as much. Okay? People are dying out there in the real world, Joe Biden, and fear-mongering over Medicare for all isn't going to quench you the nomination. I mean, I hope you keep doing it, and I hope you lose. Let's stop the deaths. Peace to you all.